So in this video, we're going to talk about the lost mines of the Shawangunk Mountains of New York. So these mountains have more tales of lost mines than anywhere else on the East Coast. Most of these tales have a similar theme. It's usually a lost silver mine that has had its entrance concealed, sometimes by a large rock. There's variations on that though. Sometimes there is treasure hidden inside the mine. And then there's also tales of the Dutch mining in this region before it was settled. And this is really what I'm interested in. I want to find out what is the oldest mine in New York State. So for those who don't know, my goal is to find and document the oldest mines in North America. I call this the Lost Mines Project. And I think this is really important because mining and the search for valuable minerals really helped shape the history of Western civilization. The rich mines that the Spanish discovered in the colonies of New Spain and Peru greatly enriched Spain and made all of the other European countries jealous and triggered their own hunts for silver mines. The silver and gold coming out of the Spanish colonies in the 1600s was way more valuable than any fur trade or agriculture taking place in the English or Dutch colonies. And because of that, everyone wanted a piece of that silver, which was thought to be found just over the next ridge in the mountains, just beyond the colonies. So my goal in the Shawangunks Mountains is really to find as many mines as possible. And to do this, I'll use a whole bunch of research as well as LiDAR. So when I go out and look for these LiDAR anomalies, I'll determine, first of all, if they are mines or natural features. I'll plot them on a map, and I'll observe the workings for any signs that could help date the mine. For example, was dynamite used or pneumatic drills? Or are the workings similar to other 17th or 18th century workings that I visited in New England and Europe? So the other goal is to LiDAR map any underground tunnels. And this will give me a pretty accurate and usable map so I can get the length, width, and height of the tunnels and see in three-dimensional fashion what these tunnels look like. So now let's dive into the tales and legends of the mines of the Shawangunks. So I'll start off with my favorite legend of lost mines in the Shawangunks. This story, I believe, was told in 1787 by a man named Samuel Dupuy. There was a mine that was worked by people in the distant past. They weren't settlers, they were there just to work the mine. And at some point, they completely left the country and the mine became lost. The Native Americans began to work this mine. It was revealed by a Native American to two men. So these guys started working the mine just prior to the Revolution, and they mined it completely in secret. They even sold the ore far away from home so they could keep everything completely secret. So when the Revolutionary War broke out, these guys joined up on the American side, and they sealed the mine with a big flat rock, and they marked 3 pine trees so that they could find the mine after the war. So as the story goes, one man was killed in the war. The other man came back afterwards to find the mine, but the entire area had been burned, and the pine trees with the markings obliterated. And as the story goes, he was never able to find the mine again. So possibly somewhere in the Shawangunks, there's a rich silver mine with a big flat rock covering the entrance. What a great legend. It just makes you want to get out there and start looking for this mine. But like I said, there are lots of legends in this area, so let's talk about a few more. So there's another tale of a mine called the Spanish Mine. So as the legend goes, a Spanish ship sailed up the Hudson. It anchored for repairs, and some of the men went ashore to explore for valuable minerals. They were taken to the mine by some Native Americans who were probably working the deposit for material for paint. And they began working the silver mine. So as the story goes, something happened and they lost favor with the Native Americans and they were all killed. This story originated in the early 1900s, and it was at that time that a tunnel was dug open by a local geologist, and it was actually turned into a source for bottled water. There was such a strong flow of water from this mine that they actually erected a water bottling plant. So unlike the first story, this one came about in the 1900s, not in the 1700s. And there was even an ad placed in the local newspaper with a $1,000 reward for any information to corroborate the story of the Spanish mining at this location. So here's a really strange story that was told as far back as the 1700s, I believe. Every 7 years, a bright light like a candle rises over a lost mine at 12 o'clock midnight and then vanishes. And the last mention of this light being seen is a July 1906 newspaper article talking about this light rising over the location of this supposed lost mine and then vanishing. Really strange story, but again, involving a lost mine. So probably the most famous story of a lost mine in the Shawangunks is the story of 99's Cave. So this story appeared sometime in the 1700s. So as the story goes, a young boy named Benny Dupuy was taken to a cave in the Shawangunks by a Native American named 99. In some stories, he's named Neopakiptik. In other stories, 99 is actually a Scotsman. So as the story goes, Benny was blindfolded and taken high up into the Shawangunk Mountains. He was taken into a cave, and he could hear water dripping in the background in the cave. When his blindfold was removed, he was shown a vein of solid silver. So there are variations on this story. So in another version, when Benny's blindfold was removed, he was shown treasure that was stashed in the cave. So these stories get really elaborate. I mean, there's oriental rugs on the floor of the cave and vases and all sorts of chests of gold and silver and gems. You know, your typical treasure story. But what they all have in common is that a young boy was taken up into the Shawangunk Mountains, taken into a cave. He could hear water dripping, the blindfold was removed, and then something of value was shown to him, either a treasure or a vein of solid silver. So this is by far the most famous story in the Shawangunks. And companies were formed to go out looking for this treasure. In 1894, a company spent $12,000 searching for this cave, which was a lot of money at that time. In 1901, there's a newspaper article stating that 99's Cave had been discovered, but there's no follow-up on this stating that any treasure or silver ore was found. So there is another variation on this story. The story of 99's Cave was mostly told on the west side of the ridge in the Mamakating Valley. On the east side, it was called the Rufe Evans Mine. So as the story goes, this man named Rufe would sell goods to the Native Americans, which they would pay for in silver ore. And one day, Rufe was blindfolded and taken into a cavern. When the blindfold was removed, the vein of silver ore was revealed to him. And there are some clues in this story. When Rufe was exiting the mine, his blindfold partially fell down, and he could see from the ridge the spire of the Shawangunk Church far below. So that kind of tells us the general area that the mine could possibly be in. So there's a really famous legend that was told about a mine in the far south end of the Shawangunk Mountains actually in New Jersey, what are called the Kittatinny Mountains. And it's the story of the Paha Quarry Mine and Old Mine Road. So as the story goes, the Dutch sometime in the mid-1600s were mining copper at the Paha Quarry Mine right on the Delaware River. And they constructed a 100-mile road from Paha Quarry to Esopus, which is now the city of Kingston, to transport the ore from the mine to the Hudson River in Esopus to be shipped to Holland. In a lot of history books, this legend actually borders on fact. There are even bronze plaques erected along Old Mine Road, what's today 209, that tells of the Dutch miners at Paha Quarry mining copper ore and shipping it along the Old Mine Road to Esopus. If this is true, this would make Paha Quarry Mine one of the oldest mines in North America. But like with all the other legends, this needs to be researched and verified. So in this legend, the Dutch didn't just mine copper at Paha Quarry, but also mined either lead or silver on the north end of the same mountain ridge, which lines up neatly with the tale of some of our lost mines in the Shawangunks. So there's one more legend that actually dates to the mid-1600s. In the colony of New Sweden, a Native American named Unapoy brought a sample of ore to the Governor Prince, and it was found that the sample contained silver and gold. So Governor Prince told the Native American that if he could bring him more samples of this ore, he would give him valuable trade goods like blue and red cloth. Unfortunately, the Native American was killed by his own tribe so as not to betray the location of this gold or silver mine. But as the story goes, Governor Prince was able to make rings and bracelets out of this ore, just showing how rich this ore must have been. It's thought that this legend is talking about a deposit in the Shawangunk Mountains. So those are a few of the most prominent legends of lost mines in the Shawangunks. Now let's talk about the fun stuff, the actual primary sources that talk about possible mines in the region. There are almost no records of mining in New Netherland. There's only a few cryptic sentences that discuss mining in the colony of New Netherland, unlike in New England, where everything was documented. We have tons of primary sources talking about very early mines in New England. In New Netherland, there's almost nothing, and what few sentences exist are very vague. So in 1646, in the Journal of New Netherland, it was mentioned that the mountains of the interior show signs of minerals. That's it. That's all we have to work with. Where was the interior? Are they talking about the Catskills or New Jersey? We don't really know. And what were these signs of minerals? We really don't know. But it could be talking about the Shawangunk Mountains. In 1647, a ship called the Princess actually foundered in the English Channel, and it was carrying hundreds of mineral samples from the colony of New Netherland. Hundreds of mineral samples. That tells us that the Dutch were actively prospecting in their colony. But what these minerals were, we'll never know because the ship went down and the minerals were lost. The next primary source we have dates to 1651, and the tale tells of a commissary named Schlechtenhorst who was arrested and imprisoned in New Amsterdam. He escaped, he got on a ship heading north up the Hudson for Beaverwick, which is basically Albany today. And the reason that he escaped is that there was a tale of a silver mine in the Catskills that he just had to check out. And he wasn't able to check it out, but he was able to send his son Garrett. And he went up into the Catskills where there was a small bowery or farm. And the daughter of the farmer had found a stone that was identified as being silver ore. But before he can get to the mine, there was a major storm. The water level rose 30 feet. It washed out the farmhouse. And that's all we really know about Garrett Van Schlechtenhorst and the search for the silver in the Catskills. Keep in mind, at the time, the Catskills enveloped a pretty large swath of land, including the Shawangunks. So this very well may have been a farm somewhere near Esopus. We actually got some really good stuff from 1659. And two men, Garrett Kuiper and Abel de Wolf, actually requested lands be granted to them that contained valuable minerals. The land that they requested was actually on Esopus Kill. Could these lands that they requested have been in the Shawangunk Mountains? So according to 17th century Dutch maps, there are two Esopus rivers. There's the Kleine Esopus and the Grote Esopus. So the small Esopus and the large Esopus. We don't know which one they were referring to. The Kleine Esopus is actually Rondout Creek today, which passes very near the Shawangunk Mountains. So the best primary source that speaks to Dutch mining is from 1659, and it talks about a man named Klaas de Ruyter, who spent time living with the Indians up in Bakeum's country. Bakeum's country, according to a 17th century Dutch map, is the Shawangunk Mountains. And de Ruyter talked about this crystal mountain that was located somewhere between the colony and the Manhattans, and crystals are found in abundance in the Shawangunk Mountains. So this goes on to talk about a copper mine that was located in the Neversinks, essentially the Raritan River in New Jersey, probably not the Pahaquarry mine. It also talks about how de Ruyter kept house with the Indians up in Bakeum's country, and it was understood from them that quicksilver could be found there, mercury. Finally, it says that on this crystal mountain was the location of the gold mine, kind of phrased in such a way where it was obvious that there was a gold mine somewhere in Bakeum's country, but this crystal mountain was the location of the gold mine. This gold mine might be related to the mid-17th century Dutch maps that show gold mine marked on the map in the Delaware River region. So there we go. We have quite a few legends and quite a few primary sources that speak to mining that may have taken place in the Shawangunk Mountains. So we talked about the legends and we talked about the primary sources. Now let's actually get out in the hills and see what we can find. So first of all, how am I going to do this? How am I going to find these mines along essentially a 100-mile mountain ridge? That's a lot of ground to cover. Well, first of all, I'm going to use LiDAR to look for anomalies that may be mines. And I'll back this up with some research and maps to determine what areas would be really good to focus on. So the plan is to start in the very far south at Pahaquarry and walk the ridge following Old Mine Road, Route 209, all the way up to Ellenville. So keep in mind this was done over the course of several years, so in the footage you may see the seasons changing sporadically, going from fall to summer to winter. That's because this was done in sections over a longer period of time. It would be very difficult to check out every LiDAR anomaly in one continuous hike along this ridge. So let's start with Baja Quarry Mine. So I parked right on the banks of the Delaware River, and first thing you see, a bronze plaque stating that this was the start of the Old Mine Road. Essentially what is called the oldest road of any great length constructed in America. So I did a lot of research on this mine before I went out to the site, and there's a lot of really good books on this mine. The most notable is The Old Mine Road, and this talks about the stories related to the mine and the road. There's also a book disputing the fact that this mine was operated by the Dutch in the 1650s. That is The Dutch, the Indians, and the Quest for Copper by Herbert Kraft. And in this book, archaeologist Herbert Kraft argues against the fact that the mine was worked by Dutch miners in the 1650s, and argues against the fact that the mine road was constructed in the 1650s to transport ore. So there's some really compelling arguments in this book, but I did quite a bit of digging to formulate my own opinions on the mine. It certainly was not a producing mine during the 1650s. My opinion is that it may have been mined by the Dutch, but simply as a prospect. The Old Mine Road also was probably not constructed by the Dutch to transport ore, but probably was an Indian trail that existed from Esopus to the Delaware River. And we have a couple clues. The best one is, we do know that in the early 1600s, a man named Cleanthes and two companions walked the trails of the Esopus Indians all through the Minisink region. This tells us that a trail system did exist, but the fact that the story says there was a network of Indian trails all through the region is really good proof that there was probably a trail from Esopus to the Delaware at that time that already existed. We also have a 1700s map that labels the road as Indian Road. Again, it's possible that there was a trail from Esopus to Baja Quarry, but it probably wasn't a road in the European sense that connected these two places. So in his book, Kraft essentially gives reasons why it would have been impossible to economically mine the copper at Baja Quarry, but that certainly doesn't mean that the Dutch couldn't have prospected in the area. We know that by 1647, over 100 mineral samples were collected and being sent back on a ship to Holland. We also know that the English were mining a black lead deposit that was 60 miles in the wilderness of Massachusetts. And if they could do it, so could the Dutch. The English were mining what they thought was silver, but turned out to be black lead. There's no reason why the Dutch couldn't have been mining in this very remote location at the time, but certainly before any of the turmoil began with the Native Americans. That means it would have been actually earlier than the stated date of the 1650s. If the English were mining deep in the wilderness, so could the Dutch. And again, mining and metallurgy was still a very esoteric art, so although the ore that they were mining at Baja Quarry could not have been profitable, they didn't know that. So I'm heading north from Baja Quarry over the New York state border, and nothing really turns up as far as good anomalies.
All right, so this was one anomaly here that was not man-made. It was actually just a weird concentration of boulders.
Okay, so it looks like I'm pretty much at the top of the hill, and here is a nice pile of tailings exposed to the surface. Oh.
This mine is most likely mid-1800s era, and I did find a sealed adit at this mine, so it might not look like much in the footage, but there are several ways to tell that this is in fact the entrance to a mine tunnel, and I do have quite a bit of experience digging these open and finding underground spaces that have not seen the light of day in sometimes hundreds of years. So I feel that this spot right here is possibly a several 100-foot long mine tunnel, but I think it most likely dates to the mid-1800s. So I'm continuing to head north, and I'm actually really enjoying finding these very remote prospect pits, just in the absolute middle of nowhere. You would never be able to find these without LiDAR, and I'm starting to get some indications of quartz crystals at this time. So I'm coming up to the Guymard mine here, and you can see the very impressive smokestack, but there's not much left in the way of mine workings. There is a shaft that's slowly subsiding, but no adits have been found. There is a really strange story with this mine regarding a man named George Servos, who claimed to have had a mining grant for the Guymard mine from the time of Queen Anne, so essentially the early 1700s, which is really unbelievable because this region was just sparsely inhabited at that time. but there may be some truth to it because there is a mine far to the north of here in Ellenville that was said to be an abandoned mine even in 1712. So 1712 would have been during the reign of Queen Anne. It is possible that the English were mining at that time. But without any dated documents, this doesn't really mean too much to me. So I'm heading north past the Guymard mine, and the next set of LiDAR anomalies I encounter are at the Wallkill mine. And there's quite a few anomalies here. I came to an open adit that was maybe 50 feet long, and I actually came to another adit that was flooded. So this mine was said to have produced lead and silver. It was said that the silver produced from the mine was enough to pay the working costs and transportation costs of the mine. So really the silver content of the ore was paying for the working and transportation, and the lead was the profit, if this story is to be believed. So we did find at this mine our first samples of galena, and you could see how this really does look like silver when it's broken open, and it's not malleable like lead. So I could see how the early settlers could mistake galena for silver. So we did explore and LiDAR scan the mine. There is a newspaper article from 1899 that states that a young girl named Mimi Conklin was thought to have fallen down the winds in this mine and drowned. And we were going to go in and try to send in the ROV into the winds to see if we could find anything deep in the flooded section of the mine. But the winds had actually been boarded over, and there were only a few small cracks between the boards that we couldn't get the 5-fish through. But we might come back with the Trident ROV and see if we could squeeze it through and dive deep into the lower reaches of the mine. So heading north from Wallkill, I did find some miscellaneous prospects and actually one adit. I'm not sure the name of this, but I did enter the adit. It ends in a shaft. The water in the shaft was really too murky to ROV, so I doubt we'll be able to find out what's at the bottom of this shaft. So moving north, I came to a couple of adits that I LiDAR scanned. There are a couple of sealed adits as well. One is soil eroded closed, and the other seems to be closed with rocks. There is a nice stone retaining wall along one side, but the trench ends in a pile of rocks, which kind of lines up with some of the legends of the mines being covered by rocks. But in this case, this is probably a result of natural erosion. The workings do have a very mid-1800s feel. The drill holes are larger and the proportions to the tunnel are larger. They may have even been reworked in the later 19th century using pneumatic drills. So I'm really having a field day with this. There are just so many LiDAR anomalies to check out, and I'm slowly coming up to my next cluster of anomalies. So I LiDAR scanned the tunnels, and I did notice that this mine was worked with dynamite, which means that it was either worked during the later 1800s or maybe reprospected at that time and the drifts lengthened. It is strange though that I did find some very small drill steels in the mine that would indicate a much earlier working than the clues I found in the mine. And in one of the small adits I actually found a mud spoon, which is a tool used to clear the shavings from the drilling process from the drill holes. Just across the street there are some LiDAR anomalies, but they're actually really close to the property of a prison, so I'm going to avoid those and keep on hiking north. So I'm hiking the ridge, coming up to the very famous Shawangunk mine. This is by far the largest mine in these mountains. So let's first check out a LiDAR anomaly near the mine. So this is probably a prospect. It appears to be an adit, but there's just not enough waste rock for it to have been driven very far. At the base of the hill here, there actually is an exploratory adit that I checked out years ago before it was gated. And this adit is interesting because in the 1950s, it was stated that there was wooden air pipe left in this adit that may have dated all the way back to the 1800s. Unfortunately, when I checked out this adit, I couldn't find any of that original wooden air pipe left intact. But far up above this adit, almost on the top of the hill, are the adits to the main Shawangunk mine workings. And again, I explored this mine years before these gates were put in, so here's some really great footage of the interior of the mine. And I'm exploring it with my friend Mike. We just entered the upper adit, and we came to this massive vein of galena with pyrite mixed in. And you could see that this is what they left behind. The vein that they mined must have been much richer. So just about all of the underground space that we're walking in this mine was once a vein of ore. And removing that vein is what created these tunnels. And this pyrite may have given rise to the story of a gold mine far in the interior. It was well known at the time that gold was associated with pyrite, And there's even some stories of pyrite being mistaken for gold, in the case of Jacques Cartier exploring the St. Lawrence River region, and in the area of Quebec City, found what he thought was gold, barreled it up, brought it back to France. It turned out to be pyrite, much to his embarrassment. And at the same time, the galena, when it's freshly broken, looks a lot like silver. So as far as the history of the mine, we talked about some of the legends. It is recorded that in 1817, a man named Daniel Niven actually located the mine with 2 other partners. However, they couldn't find the owner of the land, so they just simply kept the location of the mine a secret. And that is until one of the partners was actually talking in his sleep, and his son overheard him talking about the location of the mine and was able to actually go out and find it. So as the story goes, his son was actually able to track down the owners of the mountain and purchase the mine, which he then sold. The mine was then worked between 1830 and 1840. So really all the space that we're exploring now was created by mining this vein of ore during that decade. The mine did change hands later on in the early 1900s. It was known as the Mama Kading Mining Company, as well as the St. Nicholas Mine, and it was mined for lead during World War I. The drifts were lengthened and some exploration work was done, but it never was a major producer of lead. And by 1920, it was abandoned. And we're encountering artifacts left from that time. Exploring the Shawangunk mine, I get the feeling that this may have been the location in the legends. The vein of lead ore in this mine is just incredible. It did outcrop on the surface, and it would have been known to the local Native Americans who could have used it as a material for paint. Unfortunately, during the remediation of the mine, the part that we're exploring now was heavily backfilled, and I'm really not able to observe any clues to how the mine was worked. I was really hoping to take a look at this area. The lack of any drill marks could mean it was worked at a very early time in a very primitive way. A deposit like this could have easily have been worked in the mid-1600s. Like I mentioned before, the English were mining black lead that they thought was silver that was 60 miles into the frontier. This mine would have been roughly 32 miles from the nearest Dutch settlement of Esopus, so it really wouldn't have been a stretch to imagine Dutch miners out here on this hillside using primitive methods to mine this rich vein of galena. And this may even have been the origin of Old 99's cave and the rich vein of silver that was shown to Benny. So I passed the Shawangunks mine and I'm heading north on the ridge. The next anomaly I hit is 2 big tailings piles, and this is really mysterious.
Alright, so you can see some mounds behind me. Those are tailings piles.
This very well could be an adit that's soil eroded closed, or it could be a shaft. There is standing water in this depression at the top of the working, but there's really no evidence of lead minerals on the tailings pile. So I'm continuing along the Shawangunk Ridge here, and I want to take a second to talk a little bit about the actual hike. So first of all, going out and hitting multiple LiDAR anomalies does involve camping. I do try to keep my gear as lightweight as possible because you're essentially going up and down hills, trying to find each and every one of these coordinates.
Alright, so it's morning, and I found this little nook within this big cliffside to hunker down in, and the reward was this amazing view in the morning, and it just happened to be a spot that was just big enough for my sleeping bag. So I am trying to pack pretty light, but one thing that I have to have is the Starbucks coffee and actual real creamers, so that makes for a great morning, and I'd rather shed some weight with some other gear.
In this case, you can see I'm right on the edge of the ridge here, and I'm just soaking up the scenery. Half the fun of going out and doing these projects is just being out in this beautiful terrain. Really enjoying this hike, but now I'm coming down off the ridge to check out some LiDAR anomalies near the Red Bridge mine. So I LiDAR scanned this small mine, and I did notice that inside the mine there are a lot of quartz crystals. And I first began to see a lot of quartz crystals back at the Shawangunk mine. But in this mine I'm finding even larger crystals, some as big as 1 inch. So I did check out several LiDAR anomalies near the mine. Some of them were prospect pits, but there are 2 sealed adits at this mine. One enters into a strange geologic fold in the hillside, and the other enters almost under an old road. So unfortunately, soil erosion has sealed these adits and they're no longer accessible. But judging by the large amount of crystals on the tailings piles, these would have been geologically very interesting to explore. So I'm following this stream down to the base of the hill, and here is one of the most scenic mine adits, the Buttermilk Falls mine. So I did LiDAR scan this mine. I found no indication of any lead ore, and it definitely was a later working and even had ore car tracks. So although this adit is really picturesque, it probably doesn't date back to colonial times. So I'm hiking north from the Buttermilk Falls mine, and the next cluster of LiDAR anomalies to check out is the Ulster mine, also known as the Ellenville mine. So this mine is famous for having world-class quartz crystals, which actually lines up really nicely with the legend of the Crystal Mountain. So you can see this large open cut working. On the other side there is an adit, but it's completely blocked with large rocks. And I can sort of see in and I can hear water dripping inside. So this could be a situation where we can send in a robotic dog with a camera to check this out, or if there's water that gets deeper, maybe send in an ROV. This mine is also notable because it was actually called an old mine as early as 1712, and it does appear on some records dating to around 1720. We do know that the mine was worked later in the 1800s, but I feel that this location may be where Abel de Wolf requested the lands with minerals be granted to him. It just seems to line up. It's not too far from Rondout Creek, which was referred to as Esopus Kill at the time, and we're only 25 miles from Esopus. This would not have been a difficult journey to make to mine the minerals on this hill. So this site also lines up neatly with one of the legends that states that there was a lead or silver mine at the base of the north end of the mountain. So unlike the Shawangunk mine, which is high up on the mountain, this one is actually driven in from the base of the mountain and is pretty far north on the Shawangunk mountain range. One of the anomalies I checked out turned out to be this very primitive working.
One of my anomalies was actually a pretty substantial dug up area that a mineral collector apparently has been working. But what's interesting here is that it seems like they might have exposed some very old workings, because there are, it looks like, two veins that have been completely mined away. But the surprising thing is that there's no drill marks, and that tells me that it could have been a very primitive prospect, but most miners would have used drilling and blasting to create a tunnel like this. It could have been a site that was worked by an early prospector who was not using a drill steel and blasting powder. It may have been worked very early on during the Dutch occupation. There are tons of these large quartz crystals, really prominent. This would have certainly drew the attention of any prospector. After walking this entire ridge from the Kittatinny Mountains in New Jersey up to here, I have not seen crystals that were this large. They're found at pretty much all of the other lead mines, but none as large and well-defined as here in Ellenville.
This may have been worked by the Native Americans with very primitive means. I did look around for any sign of hammerstones or any way that the Native Americans could have been working this. I know there is one legend that Native Americans were working a deposit near the town of Olive by using hatchets, and I did find at a black lead mine that dates to the early 1700s a broken axe head.
All right, so this was a pretty interesting find. So it's actually an old axe blade, but look at how bent it is. They may have been using this in the mine to split the rock.
So maybe that was one way to split and remove the ore here, but they certainly weren't using drill steels. There's also a Native American legend that states that in Ellenville, there's a place where the wind blows so fiercely that a fire could be made that can reach temperatures high enough to smelt metals. So I also want to mention that there is a sealed adit at this site. Now, there's no telling if this dates back to colonial times or if it was a later working when the mine was operated in the 1800s. Without digging open the adit, there would be no way to know. And at some point it could yield important information about the mine. So just a short hike north of the Ellenville or Ulster mine, I came to the Spanish mine, also known as the Sunray Tunnel. So you could see the Sunray water bottling plant over here. And this tunnel here is the one that was rediscovered in the early 1900s. So I explored and LiDAR scanned this mine, and I did notice that this tunnel, unlike any other tunnel I've seen in the Shawangunks, has much smaller proportions and smaller drill holes. This tunnel appears to have been driven identically to a tunnel in Connecticut that has a confirmed 18th century date. It's not perfectly straight, it has very small drill holes, it's driven to very small proportions, and of course none of these clues could be used to positively date a mine working. This could have been driven much later, but using primitive means, we really don't know. But I can say with absolute certainty that this adit is unlike any of the others that I encountered on my entire hike. There actually is pyrite in here, and you can see some galena, but it's nowhere near as rich as the vein in the Shawangunk mine. There's also an incline working up on the hill. This has a mixture of very small and very large drill holes, telling me that it was probably reprospected and lengthened at some point in time. This was the supposed site where the Spanish were mining silver. There's legends that state that the Spanish were sailing up the Hudson as late as the 1680s. We do know that this land was Spanish territory at one time. Very early maps show this land as Esteban Gomez land. There are definitely no primary sources that state that the Spanish ever sailed north out of New York Bay into the Hudson River. It is strange, though, that one of the first people to inhabit the Mamakating Valley was a man named Manuel Gonzalez, who was said to be a Spaniard.
All right, so I'm coming up this trail here, and you can see directly behind me an airport, and that airport is the location of the grave of the oldest inhabitant of this valley, Manuel Gonzalez. And I mean, that might seem like a pretty strange thing for there to be a Spaniard living in essentially an English and Dutch colony. Just the presence of a Spaniard may have given rise to some of the legends of the Spanish mines. But he may have been a Protestant, a Spanish Protestant who was just seeking refuge from persecution in the wilderness, the far fringe of the known world at the time, which would have been this valley.
Although he lived just below the Shawangunk Mountain, there's no record of him ever having mined. His gravestone can even still be seen on the airport just below the Shawangunk mine. Maybe it was one of his sons or grandsons that was mining this deposit. We really don't know. We know that Samuel Gonzalez was famous for escaping from the Indians by jumping off Sam's Point onto some pine trees below and surviving to tell the tale. After this feat, he became a celebrated frontiersman. Again, no record of any of the Gonzalezes ever having mined in the area. So where did the story of the Spanish mine come from? Well, it could have been simply fabricated in the early 1900s to help promote the water bottling business. Since the Ulster Mine and the Sunray Tunnel are so close together, I feel that these two workings together constituted one mine that may have been first claimed by Abel de Wolf in the 1650s. North of here, the terrain becomes very rugged. I was not able to find any more LiDAR anomalies. I know there is one possible mine north of here called the Fordamore Mine that was said to enter into the base of a cliff, but I really couldn't find anything that matches this description in the area. So I'm really happy with my hike through the Shawangunk Mountains. I checked out over 100 LiDAR anomalies. I've scanned about 15 mines. I found 6 or 7 sealed adits that may have potential for someday revealing more information about mining in this area. And I just generally enjoyed being up in the mountains and taking in the scenery. In the 1600s, this was a land where anything was possible. The closest thing we could experience to this today would be mining on the moon. At that time, it was perfectly reasonable to take enormous risks and to prospect far out on the frontier in hopes of finding silver mines equal to those of the Spanish in the colonies of New Spain and Peru. Although these mines never produced any fortunes for the people that worked them, they certainly did produce something equally valuable. Legends that continue to arouse the curiosity of generation after generation here in the Shawangunk Mountains.